Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes is the latest book to be released for 5th edition. It has a lot in common with Volo's Guide to Monsters, so if you have read that book, then you'll have a fairly good idea of what to expect. It is essentially a monster manual with 5 chapters of additional lore that ties in with many of the creatures being presented, and a handful of player races sprinkled in for good measure. The book starts off strong with a chapter detailing the Blood War, the endless war that rages between devils and demons, giving a good rundown on each side's thoughts on the conflict. A lot of the focus of this chapter is on the individual demon lords and archdevils that command the forces of the Abyss and the Nine Hells. Not entirely surprising, considering that several of those fiends are presented later on in the monster chapter of this book. Options are presented for DMs to customize cultist creatures with additional powers, and alternative spells for both devil and demon worshippers, which really opens up for some interesting foes. And there are options to customize cambions for both sides as well. I really liked those parts. For players, options are given for sub-races for tieflings, with ties to each of the archdevils that rule the different layers of the Nine Hells. Although something similar but slightly less extensive appeared in the Sword Coast campaign guide, I think this will be something that a lot of players will still appreciate. The chapter also offers a host of tables to flesh out themes, which is always nice. Unfortunately, the book then takes a huge nosedive in the next chapter on Elves. I was massively disappointed by the extensive and frankly unnecessary changes that have been made to Elvish mythology. The entire chapter is filled with confusing and sometimes contradictory information. The relationships between the gods have both been muddled beyond recognition and oversimplified. Especially the conflict between Corallon and Lolth has been changed in ways that make the story of the fall of a drow sound less like an epic war for all of creation, and more like a petty squabble about whether or not it's okay to have a physical form. An attempt was made to make the Elvish gods ever-changing forces rather than physical beings, and it mostly left them unrelatable and uninteresting. The best D&D gods, in my opinion, are ones you can interact with, and sadly that cannot be said about the Elvish pantheon in this book. The only part about the Elvish lore I liked was the Reverie, a concept I first read about in the complete book of Elves in 2nd edition, that when elves rest, they relive the memories of their lives. It was an interesting idea I always enjoyed. Sadly, that is a little bit ruined in this book by the addition that now all elves are reincarnated, and as children, and when they grow old, they relive their past lives. It just doesn't feel like it fits with how elves have been portrayed in the past. I find it hard that elvish society would work the way it does if every elven child spent several hours every night remembering what it was like being in their previous lives. The elves that are described here sound a lot more like the Deva of 4th edition. The idea isn't bad, it just doesn't fit. If elves truly were so aware of their previous lives, it would shape so much more of their current lives. If you as a child remembered being a legendary figure from elvish history, then wouldn't other elves treat you differently? One of the biggest problems with the whole chapter is that it is presented as absolute truth, and it's presented as the one truth of all elfkind on all worlds. It really does make me think a lot about the complete book of Elves, which, if you haven't heard about it, was not a very popular book that really messed up elves for an entire generation of D&D. They even go as far as suggesting that elves living on other worlds, such as Dragonlance, where there are no drow, will eventually change to be like all other elves, because they just haven't gotten around to being divided, like they would somehow be out of sync with the main elf timeline. The whole thing is just very confusing. There are so many different worlds in D&D, and the elves in most of those do not work the same. Trying to force them all to share the same origin and mythology is a bad move. The only elves any of the information in the book seems to apply to are the Elves of Greyhawk and Forgotten Realm, and to be honest, I prefer the old lore in these worlds much more than what's presented here. The worst thing about the whole chapter is that it felt boring and uninspired. Each and every chapter in this book, and in Volo's, filled me with ideas about the subject. I couldn't wait to add hags to my adventures when I read through Volo's, and I must have come up with half a dozen characters while reading the gnome and halfling chapters in this book. But the only thing I thought about while reading the elf chapter was, when is this over? Things only get worse towards the end of the chapter when the Shadar-kai and the Raven Queen get thrown into the whole mix. In a super confusing move, both of them are now elves. I believe the Shadar-kai started out as fey beings, but I knew them best as humans, living in the Shadowfell, cursed to a terrible fate and living life to the largest extreme just so they could feel. Now they're chronically depressed elves that serve the Raven Queen by sitting around in a ruin and waiting for her to ask them to run off into a world and steal some random knickknacks. Now the Raven Queen was probably my favorite goddess back in 4th edition. Who didn't want to play an Avenger sworn to the Raven Queen to destroy all undead? And I love Critical Role, where she's a huge figure. But the Raven Queen really shouldn't have been in this book. She feels absolutely forced in, and she is now no longer a goddess, but some even more powerful but strange entity that defies definition, like some sort of bargain bin lady of pain. And somehow she was an elvish queen who got involved in the struggle between Corlon and Lolth, even though physical elves with kingdoms shouldn't really have been a thing before the two duked it out. The whole thing is a confusing mess, and it feels like pandering to the fans of the Raven Queen. She doesn't have to be in every D&D setting. We were perfectly happy with her the way she was, and you don't need to force her in anywhere else. Thankfully, the player options presented at the end of the chapter are good. Even though I think the Shadowkai should have been their own playable race and not elves, we are presented with rules for playing them. We also get rules for playing two of the other elf subraces I've been waiting a long time for, namely the Sea Elves and the Eladrin. The book bounces back in the next chapter, detailing the dwarf and the Duergar though, giving us a very good breakdown of how our societies and gods work. There's even some information from there about how the dwarves of other planes work. We also get rules for playing Duergar, even though that was something that was mentioned in the Sword Coast Adventures Guide. It was still nice to see it here though. The 4th chapter talks about the Githyanki and the Githzerai and their civil war, giving us a good look at both races, their history and philosophy. We get a look at the Githyanki capital of Tunaraf, and I especially liked that we got stats for the silver swords of the Githyanki and descriptions for both races' vessels. The chapter also offers rules for playing both Githyanki and Githzerai, which isn't really something any of my players have requested, but I still find it very nice to have. I can see a lot of potential in playing either of them. The last lore chapter of the book was perhaps the most surprising, and the one I originally felt wouldn't fit into the book. Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes was presented as a book detailing some of the greatest conflicts throughout the multiverse. The Blood War, Elves vs Drow, Dwarves vs Duergar, the Gith Civil War. And then we have the Gnomes and the Halflings, two races known for avoiding wars and staying out of conflicts. And maybe it doesn't fit in, but it's a damn good chapter. Reading about the Halflings and the Gnomes and their gods just made me happy. There's so much interesting lore there, and I just kept coming up with ideas for characters. I thought that the Blood War would be the most interesting chapter of the book, or possibly the Gith, but the chapter on Small Folk turned out to be the real winner. We also get rules for playing Svirfneblin, or Deep Gnomes, as they more commonly known by most. Those rules have been posted in the Princes of the Apocalypse Compendium and the Sword Coast Adventures Guide previously, though. And so we get to the real meat of the book, the Bestiary. Roughly half the book consists of monsters, and boy are there some nice ones in there. I'm not going to go over a full list here or anything, but there are definitely some that I had been missing from 5th edition, such as the Choker, Deathlocks, Armenites, Narzagons, and of course my personal favorite monster from this book, the Gith, as Gith with 2 Fs and not Gith with the TH, although those are in there as well. As in Spacefaring Mercenary Hippoman, armed to the teeth with black powder weaponry, straight out of Spelljammer. As I mentioned earlier, we do get stats for the more famous Demon Lords and several Archdevils. Sadly not Dissipator though, which I personally would have liked to see. I would also like to point out that the one monster I felt they really messed up, the Zaratan. In Al-Qadim, the Zaratan were huge sea turtles with islands on their backs. They weren't really something you battled so much as fantastical locations you visited. But I always loved them. For some reason, they felt it necessary to change them into Elder Earth Elementals. So now they're land turtles. Why? If they wanted giant Earth Elementals with landscapes on their backs, why use the Zaratan that is a sea creature? Maybe it's just me, but I don't like that change. Overall, though, the monsters are great, and there's a large amount of high-level monsters, which is something that was needed. So, what are my overall thoughts? Although there are parts of the book I really didn't enjoy, I think my overall impression of the book is good. It is for the most part a very well written book that really gets my imagination going. There is a lot of information in it that is repeated from other sources. Some of the player's options have been posted in various books before, and several of the new monsters, especially the Durgar and Demon Princes, are taken straight from Out of the Abyss. If you already own every book that has been written, then that is something to think about. Personally, this book is a must-buy for me as a DM. I do not think there's enough here for players though. This is essentially a monster compendium, and that is what it will be used for. If you're interested in one of the new races, then ask to borrow your DM's copy. The Dwarf and Smallfolk chapters might be a pull for someone interested in playing a character of those races, but they're just too short for me to recommend buying an entire book for them. Well, thanks for watching my video. What are your thoughts on Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes? Have you picked it up yet? If you enjoyed my review, then please subscribe down below to see more, and don't forget to press the bell icon so you don't miss out whenever I upload new content. If you want to support my channel, then please leave a like, it really helps out a lot. You can also share this video with your friends, follow me on Tumblr or Twitter, or check out my DM's Guild products. Links in the description to all of that. Well, until next time, Dungeon Delvers.